Hey everybody, welcome to Cokesbury Church. My name is Stephen, I'm the senior pastor here, and if this is your first weekend with us, I want to let you know that we are meeting in person. And so if you're ever in the Knoxville area, we'd love to meet you face to face. We have 3 opportunities. All the information you need is at cokesbury.tv. Want to encourage you to come and be a part of what God's doing here at Cokesbury Church. I also want to let you know that we have a chat, and we would love to connect with you. That's a great way to engage in this time that we spend together, and so feel free to jump in the chat, introduce yourself. There's lots of folks that would love to say hey to you. So we're in this series that we're calling Big Little Lies, and we're looking at how we can combat some of those lies that you and I have a tendency to allow to run rampant in our minds. And I think most of us would be willing to admit that when it comes to living out our faith, and when it comes to successfully following Jesus, the battlefield is not really out there, right? It's actually in here. It's in our thoughts. It's in those feelings that we have a tendency to internalize. It's in that negative self-talk that we rehearse with ourselves over and over. And it's even in the quiet whisper from the enemy. And that convinces us that we're not strong enough, or we're not smart enough, or maybe we're not worthy enough to be loved or to be used by God. And so that's what this series is about. In week 1, we looked at the lie that I'm done, right? And we talked about how even when you feel like you're done, God isn't done with you. As long as you and I are still drawing air into our lungs, there's still a plan and a purpose for our lives. And then last week, Anna Lee was here, and we talked about how the lie of I'm on my own. And we said that you're never really on your own when God is with you, that God is not plopped us on this planet and left us to be by ourselves, but that every moment of every day, even when your mama turns her back on you, that God is still with us, that you're never actually alone. And today I want to talk about a really big lie, and that is the lie that the worst is on the way. And I want to encourage you in this. When you look at the scriptures from Genesis literally through Revelation, you see this concept that God is always preparing a future for his people. We even see this in Jesus when he's speaking about the next life. He said to his disciples, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I'm going to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am. And you know the way to the place where I'm going." And the point is that even when we fear the most, God is still working to bring the best for his people. And that's what I want to dig into a little bit today. We're going to look at a very famous passage. It's Jeremiah 29, verse 11. And this is one of those verses, right, that people love to plaster on social media, or we'll stick it on our fridge, or maybe we'll tattoo it on our bodies. We'll use it all over the place. And one thing I know for sure is that we often fail to take into account the larger context of this verse. So here it is. You already know it. Jeremiah says to the people of Israel, "For I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord. They are plans for good and not for disaster, to give you a future and a hope." A future and a hope. This is what God was giving his people. And that sounds awesome, right? Like, who could not get fired up by that? To be going through life and to think, well, God's got a future and a hope for me, and I've just got to hang on long enough to experience that. And what I've found is it's important to factor in the context of this verse. It's not something designed to throw up on social media, nor is it intended for us to use that kind of verse as sort of a veiled way of bragging to other people that things are going our way. When you look at Jeremiah 29, this verse comes to the Israelites when they find themselves in one of the lowest moments of their entire history. Like, there's 28 chapters that precede this verse. And so let me kind of set the stage. The Israelites have been conquered and taken into captivity by their arch enemy, the Babylonians. And we are told the reason all the way back in Jeremiah chapter 1. Here's what God says through the prophet. "Listen, I'm calling the armies of the kingdoms of the north to come to Jerusalem. I, the Lord, have spoken. They will set their thrones at the gate of the city. They will attack its walls and all the other towns of Judah. I will pronounce judgment on my people for all of their evil. for deserting me and burning incense to other gods. Yes, they worship idols made of their own hands. Get up and prepare for action. Go out and tell them everything that I say to you. And so what Jeremiah is communicating to the people of Israel is that because of their disobedience and their willingness to walk away from God, they are faced with the natural consequences of that decision. Because here's a fundamental truth. When you and I make a decision that we're going to consciously walk away from God, we're also walking away from God's protection. So the Babylonians show up and they overthrow Jerusalem and they tear down the temple, which that right there would have been a really big deal because the temple represented the physical presence of God. And so if you tear down the temple, that would cause the Israelites to feel like that God had actually literally straight up walked away from them. The people had been pulled into captivity and carried hundreds of miles away into Babylon. So when Jeremiah shares these words, he's sharing them with a group of people who had lost absolutely everything. Like they had lost their savings. There is no 401k. They had lost their homes. They had lost their family land. They had lost their farms. If they'd been able to accumulate any generational wealth at all, that was now gone. Their leaders were gone. Their place of worship was gone. And listen, that meant that they had lost their entire identity. There's absolutely nothing left, and all they would have seen is disaster and loss. Does that sound familiar? Think about the past couple of weeks. There's been a mass shooting almost every single day. Unarmed black and brown people are being killed. There's deep political division. We've still got a pandemic. There's job loss, there's financial strain. Some of us are battling anger and disappointment and frustration. On top of that, we've got some loneliness and a lot of people who still feel somewhat isolated. That's where the Israelites were. And it's in that moment that God comes to them through Jeremiah and he says, "For I know the plans I have for you. They are plans for good and not for disaster, to give you a future and a hope." Listen, your disaster does not define your destiny. Your failure does not define your destiny. Your shortcomings, your bad decisions, that addiction you've been battling, the mistakes that you've made, according to what I'm reading right here, they don't get to decide your destiny. According to Jeremiah, it's God and God alone who determines your destiny and my destiny. And so that means that even when we fear the worst, God is actually preparing his best. And right now, you may be in a season of your life where you're like, man, I'm looking around and things look really bad right now. In fact, it feels like things can only get worse. But listen to me, they may be bad. And they may even get a little worse in the short term. It may get harder, it may get tougher, but God is always calling his people to have hope. He's calling us to look forward, to look past the immediate situation to what God is preparing for each of us. And for those of us who are followers of Jesus, I'm telling you, from Genesis to Revelation, the scriptures declare that the best is absolutely yet to come. You and I have not seen it yet. It's still out there. It's on the way. God is getting it ready. And one day we will see that the best is absolutely yet to come. Now that's good news. But what do we do now? Like, what do we do in the meantime? What do we do in that in-between time from our current situation until we experience God's future best? Well, there's two principles that I see in this story that I think are really important. The first one is this, that you gotta look past your disaster. You gotta look past your disaster. I wonder, you guys like animals? Like I saw this picture that I think you'll like. It's called First Kiss. Check this out. So there you've got this mama giraffe and she's leaning way down and she's kissing her brand new baby giraffe. And it's just sort of this cute little warm fuzzy thing, right? Like we all could use a little bit more warm fuzzy from time to time. And what's fascinating is that's not actually what happens with baby giraffes. Thanks to Discovery Plus, I've learned about this. Saw this documentary. It was a zoo that got to witness the birth of a baby giraffe. It's kind of a rare thing in captivity. And so you got this big mother giraffe and she's getting ready to give birth. And what's fascinating is she does not lie down to give birth. She actually gives birth standing up. So the first thing that happens when a baby giraffe comes into the world is that baby literally drops like 6 or 8 feet straight to the ground, right? And if that's not traumatic enough, the first thing the mama giraffe does is the baby quickly tries to get its legs up under itself. So the mom walks over to the baby and she kicks it. And the baby giraffe kind of goes rolling across the ground. And that seems kind of cruel, right? Like, it's bad enough you've just dropped, but now you're getting kicked by your own mama. Well, she does this because she wants the giraffe to get up. And so the little giraffe, sure enough, starts to get itself together. And eventually it gets its wobbly legs up under it, and it's able to stand up. And so everybody there at the zoo, they're like cheering and clapping, right? Because this is like amazing. We're getting to witness this life come into existence, and it's unbelievable. And so while they're cheering and doing all that stuff, the mother giraffe walks over to the baby, and she kicks it again and knocks it down. And the reason she does that is simple. She doesn't just want the baby to get up. She wants the baby to remember how to get up. That's what happens in real life when a giraffe is born. It's not first kiss, it's first kick. Because a giraffe that can't get up is a giraffe that can't eat. And a giraffe that can't get up is a giraffe that can't defend itself. And a giraffe that can't get up is a giraffe that cannot thrive and grow and live its life. So the first thing a mom does is teach her baby how to pick itself back up. Now, here's what I know. A lot of us, if we could be honest, we want life to look and feel like the first kiss, right? Like life should be easy and it should be nurturing, and for the most part, it should be quite comfortable. But what we actually experience feels more like first kick than first kiss, doesn't it? There are some of us, if we could be honest with ourselves, we feel like we've been kicked around. We've been kicked around at work. We've been kicked around in our family. Maybe we've been kicked around in life itself. And we're thinking to ourselves, I'm not really sure where God is in all of this. I just feel like I keep getting kicked. Well, the Bible never says that you and I are going to avoid trouble. And if your image of God is like that first kiss moment, you're going to be frustrated when you face difficulties in life. In fact, Jesus put it like this. He says to his closest friends, I have told you this so that you may have peace in me. Here on earth, you will have many trials and sorrows, but take heart, for I have overcome the world. That's what you and I are supposed to hang on to. Yes, we get kicked around, and yes, we get knocked down. But what we have to hold on to in the moment is hope. And for believers, hope is literally this confident expectation of good that is based on God and who God is. Therefore, hope is able to look past the current situation and believes fundamentally that God is working for the good of his people. It's able to look past that moment and be convinced that God will work all things together for his glory, that God isn't finished, that God does not abandon or turn his back on his kids. Listen, fear says, my plans have fallen apart, but hope says, God's plan is still coming together. Fear says, I will lose everything, but hope says, I will always have enough. Fear says, look at the risk, but hope follows right behind and says, no, look at the reward. Fear says, it will never work out, but hope says, God works all things together for my good. Fear says, this is going to ruin my life, but hope says, God can renew and restore my life. Fear says, I got to protect the future, but hope says, God is preparing my future, and there's nothing that can come along that can stop him from giving it to me. Fear says, don't take another step, but hope says, take your next step in faith. Fear asks, what if I get hurt? But hope asks, what if I get healed? Fear says, I'm on my own. Hope says, God will never leave me. Fear says the worst is sure to happen, but hope says the best is on the way. So look past your disaster. Even when you fear the worst, hang on to the fact that God is preparing the very best. Now, the second principle that I see in this is really important. and it's don't fade away. When you find yourself in a moment where it feels like life is overwhelming, or it feels like there's not a way out, or you feel like your back's against the wall, or even in the middle of the night when that voice is speaking into your ear that's convincing you that the worst is still on the way, don't fade away. This is a season right now with all of the chaos that our world and our country faces, where the temptation is to kind of pull back and to start to fade away. And we've all got friends who've experienced this, right? Like, you literally know people who over the past year, they've become disconnected and disengaged. Maybe they're starting to lose their passion. They're fading away over these past 12 to 14 months. They're not going to church. They're not hanging out with their friends. When you try to catch up with them, they're very hard to find. And it feels like in a lot of ways that they've basically given up. And I gotta tell you, I think that's really, really sad. It seems like when life is okay, when things are working out, when we're getting a few wins, when our job's going okay, our marriage is good, our kids find themselves in a good place, it seems like we don't really have an issue holding on to hope. But you let a little disappointment, you let a failure show up, you let us experience a setback or a struggle, and that's when hope tends to evaporate really pretty quickly. This is what happened to the Israelites. They found themselves in Babylon. They didn't ask to be there. They've been taken there as captives. And so the people just started to pull back. They're not having kids. They're not building homes. They're not even taking care of things. They're not doing the normal things of life. It's like the whole world changed in an instant, and so everything stopped. And yet God comes to them and he says some very interesting things. This is Jeremiah 29, verse 4. This is what the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of Israel, says to all the captives he has exiled to Babylon from Jerusalem. Build homes and plan to stay. Plant gardens and eat the food they produce. Marry and have children. Then find spouses for them so that you may have grandchildren. It's huge. See, the false prophets were coming along and they were telling the people of Israel, this is not going to last very long. But God, through Jeremiah, told his people, no, they're actually not telling you the truth. You're going to be in captivity for 70 years. Now imagine that. Like, can you imagine if somebody came along and said coronavirus is going to last 70 years? Like, I can't even, right? Like, and by the way, I don't believe that. But some of these Israelites, they were faced with the reality, 70 years? Like, I'm gonna die here in this foreign land. It's awful, it's over. And so God comes to them and he says, no, it's not over. Plant gardens, build homes, sink your roots deep, don't fade away. And then he says to them in verse 6, multiply, right? Like some of you guys are gonna use that tonight. Well, Pastor said multiply, honey. We should practice, right? Multiply, don't dwindle away, and work for the peace and prosperity of the city where I sent you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, for its welfare will determine your welfare. See, this is not where they wanted to be. And yet God comes to them and says, I get that this is not where you want to be, but this is where you are. So work in that moment. Work for peace. Work for prosperity. Why? Well, according to Jeremiah, it's for the welfare of the people in the city where you're being held captive. If they succeed, you succeed. Don't dwindle away. I was thinking this week, you guys like Shawshank Redemption? I think it's one of the greatest movies of all time. In fact, if you think there's a movie better than Shawshank Redemption and you're in the chat, I'd love to know what that is. It's a great movie, but there's a line in that movie, maybe you remember, it says, get busy living or get busy dying. I think that's the question that God was asking the Israelites, and I think it's the question he's asking us. Are you going to get busy living or are you gonna get busy dying? Are you gonna stay stuck? Or are you gonna move forward? Are you gonna stay angry and bitter? Or are you gonna actually get up and start acting? Are you gonna let this wreck your life, or are you gonna actually go out and seek joy? Are you gonna hold on to the grudge, or are you gonna find a way to move past it? What are you gonna do? Listen, I know it's easy to pull back right now, but now is not the time. Now is the time to find a little courage. Now is the time to start showing a little more trust. Now is the time to step out in faith and actually go for it. See, it's a mindset, right? Paul said, don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. It's the exact same thing that God was trying to say through Jeremiah. The battle that you're facing is not with the Babylonians. It's a battle in the heart. It's a battle in the mind. And if you will change the way you think, if you will get a fresh perspective, you'll learn to know God's will. And you'll be reminded that God is good and that God is pleasing, that God is perfect. See, it's a mindset that's got to be relentless in saying, I'm not going to dwindle. I'm not going to fade away. I'm going to keep moving forward, and I'm going to live my life. God essentially was telling Israel, get up and start living. Plant gardens, have kids, go to work for peace, work for prosperity. Don't just wait on that better day to come. I'm telling you, it's on the way, but part of the way it's gonna get here is you gotta engage in the moment. You can't shut down, you can't pull back. You gotta keep on keeping on, because that's where God works in the lives of his people. It's not someday, it's right now. And one thing I know is that so often people think that only people in ministry are the people that are actually doing God's work. Like there's this thin line between the sacred and the secular. But I'll be honest with you, the longer I live, the more convinced I am that every single thing that you and I do, literally from the most mundane to the most challenging, it's all God's work. Paul told the church, work willingly at whatever you do, as though you were working for the Lord rather than for people. It's powerful, man. That literally means that every time you wake up and you care for your family, you're doing God's work. Every time you go to work or you go to school and you actually engage in that process, you're doing God's work. Every time you step up and you encourage somebody that you love in your life to keep on keeping on, to not give up, to not dwindle away, you're doing God's work. Every time you create something beautiful and useful, every time you improve your mind or help others learn to understand, you're doing God's work. Every time you take a walk and you exercise or you take care of yourself, you're doing God's work. Every time you engage with your faith community, every time you pray for somebody or help somebody, every single time you show up and do good, you're actually doing God's work. Y'all, listen, the Bible promises that nothing you do for God is ever wasted or lost. So take a stand. Even when you fear the worst, God is preparing his best. That's a word for somebody this right now, because there's somebody out there, you've allowed yourself to coast. You've allowed yourself to be so overcome with fear and anxiety that it has literally stopped you in your tracks. You may be going through the motions, you may be drawing air into your lungs, but you're just waiting, hoping that maybe this thing's gonna end. And listen, it is going to end. But in the meantime, the clock of your life and my life is ticking. We have to anticipate what tomorrow's gonna bring, but we can't do anything about that because tomorrow's not here yet. We can keep looking over our shoulder, but what happened in the past, there's not one thing we can do to correct that. So all of our living, it's gotta happen in this moment right here, right now. We've gotta keep working. We can't allow ourselves to dwindle, because God's got a plan. It's not a plan for disaster. He's got a future and a hope. And he's waiting on ordinary people like you and like me to find the courage we need to keep doing his work, to keep loving our families, to keep engaged with our work or school or whatever task God's laid before us. to keep being an encouragement, to keep being a light on a shining hill, to keep doing the work that he has for his body to do, to keep taking care of ourselves, to keep bending our knees in prayer, to keep extending an open hand to somebody in need, to realize that when our city and when our community succeeds, we succeed. So what's it gonna be for you? What's it gonna take for you to find the faith to just say, you know what, I've had enough of this. I'm gonna take what's going on in our world very seriously. But I'm not just gonna sit back and commentate, or I'm not just gonna sit back and wish something was different. But I'm gonna re-engage, like I'm gonna get off the couch. I'm gonna get out of the house. I'm gonna start engaging with the world that is so quickly passing me by. See, I think when you and I do that, we're stepping closer to being the people that God is asking us to be. God's just asking us to allow him to use us, to trust him enough to believe that he's got a plan and that he's got a purpose and that he's working for the good for every single one of us. And so maybe this week, over the course of the next 7 days till you and I see each other again, maybe the task is simple. Maybe it's as simple as praying, God, this week, would you open up just one door? And would you help me find the courage to step through that door? To realize that there's a whole world out there. It may not look like it did 14 months ago, but that world is still there. There's still people who need to be loved and encouraged and cheered on. And would you let me play a part in that? I promise you, if you'll do that, you'll start to see a change of perspective. And if you can change your perspective, it can change your life. Guys, I love you. Thanks for tuning in today. I can't wait to see you again. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen.